If you nail these principles, the training can be very potent, very manageable, and progress is often better. And you also stick with it.
We head into a hypertrophy phase that's going to be really dedicated towards trying to build some muscle in key areas that will help us drive our lifts.
Thinking about long-term development for a lifter using Genesis, we want that lifter to get more jacked.
So what is Genesis? How would you describe it?
Genesis is our methodology, because ultimately when you are delivering any sort of programming, there is methodology underlying it. But importantly, that methodology is built upon principles, and those principles are in alignment with arguably the most important principle in all of exercise science and maybe even physiology, and that is specificity. So at the end of the day, we take these principles, most notably specificity, and Evolve is our way of helping the lifter execute specificity. Seems simple, but we'll dive into some examples of how exactly we do that, because it's a lot easier said than done. And there's some, what we would like to think, there's some pretty cool wrinkles to do that.
Yeah, I mean, not to belabor the point too much, but it's just an applied framework to deliver specificity at every single level of a training program.
So does that mean users are going to be squatting 7 times, squat, bench, and deadlifting 7 times a week?
I mean, if they want to win.
If they want to win, yeah.
Right.
So the reason I bring that up is because the final caveat I'll add is it's within constraints. In a perfect world, if you had unlimited recovery capacity, unlimited mental energy to spend in the gym, unlimited time to spend in the gym, you, like, jokes aside, you probably would do that. In theory, that would be best, is to use maximum specificity of movement, very high frequencies, potentially pretty high volumes, right? But the idea is, how do we get as close to theoretically optimal based on the constraints of the lifter, okay? And there's a reason why there's a lot of flexibility, and why Kristen, this may or may not be true, you might end up benching 5 times per week, and Zach might end up benching 2 times per week, right? So how do we take these principles, how do we take this prioritization of specificity, which is key, but how can that lead to very different programs depending on the needs, the preferences, and the constraints of the lifter? And I think understanding that conceptually is helpful to not only understand the product, but also use the product to its full capability, because in a lot of ways, this new chapter for Evolve is empowering the lifter to take advantage of that flexibility.
Yeah, just to give one more analogy with it, the way that I like to view it is, traditional views of specificity are pretty unifaceted, meaning people often think about mostly exercise selection, but maybe load. I kind of view specificity as more of like a high dimensional problem where there's like thousands upon thousands of ways in which your training can be more or less specific. So I kind of think about it like a dartboard, right? There is a bullseye isn't just the like kind of the circumference of the actual dart. There's, multiple places a dart could fit in the bullseye. And that's effectively what we're trying to do with the training program. We have a region of specificity that's going to lead to the best results for a lifter. And we're just trying to find one of the solutions that allows them to meet that solution within their given constraints, their schedule, preferences, those kind of things. So that to me is essentially what we're trying to do.
So how does Genesis design a training program or a macrocycle?
So yeah, that's kind of the highest level of program design. You might have seen the term macrocycle in like a textbook or a more technical YouTube video or whatever the case may be. Or you might see it just explained as like a long-term plan or
training cycle,
a full training cycle. Yeah, those are all basically the same core idea we're getting at here. And this is a really good thing to talk about after we establish the importance of specificity, because within specificity, there are underlying elements of the adaptations that drive strength, right? Strength in and of itself is not necessarily an adaptation. Strength is an expression that allows you to move from point A to point B, a given amount of load in the context of powerlifting, and a given amount of load for 1 rep, right? But I'm sure a lot of folks listening have heard of hypertrophy blocks or strength blocks, or maybe even work capacity blocks. They might have heard of deloads, right? And the the macrocycle design is specific to the adaptations that underlie strength in a way that allows for peak performance at a given time. That time might be a competition you have scheduled, that might be a mock meet in the gym, or it might just be the fact that in order to get as strong as possible in the long term, even if you don't care to do that in the gym, you have to kind of cycle between slightly different emphasis, slightly different things to emphasize. And that doesn't mean that you're going to be doing, marathons in January to ultimately build up to your test on December 31st. It is just a slight shift in emphasis. And I think a lot of modern powerlifting programs, good ones, I would like to say, kind of reflect that slight shift in emphasis. So there is going to be a pretty high degree of specificity year-round, but a slight shift in the most important thing for the lifter to allow them to develop those underlying qualities to ultimately maximize long-term strength development.
And so you touch on these different phases. So there's like a strength phase or a hypertrophy phase. And how would you say that Genesis would determine which phase this lifter is in?
Yeah, so I think that's ultimately going to be dependent on what the lifter perceives, and ultimately we have recommendations for this as well. But it's ultimately what they perceive is holding them back. So typically speaking, you're going to perform training that's going to prepare you to have a higher strength capacity, maybe farther from the point which you want to be your strongest. And then closer to the point that you want to be your strongest, you're going to train in a way that's going to help you express that strength capacity. And so the distribution of how much training you're kind of doing for either goal is ultimately going to be dependent on whatever the lifter feels is holding them back the most. So think about a lifter earlier in their career, maybe who doesn't have a ton of experience under the bar. They're probably going to have a little bit more time that would be best spent kind of building that strength capacity, building some more muscle, getting some more just general work capacity with the movements, things like that. Whereas somebody who is maybe really, really close to their genetic ceiling is looking to really maximize their proficiency, both from their technical aspects, but also some underlying neuromuscular characteristics, maybe spending a little bit more time in kind of strength-oriented phases. You could also make an equally probably valid argument to kind of flip that logic, but the point is whatever we feel is the kind of the limiting factor there, we can dedicate more of the training towards one of those goals.
Yeah, and this is a theme that you'll probably notice throughout the video is that there are going to be things that if you do just want to follow what the app says, we would like to think the recommendations are pretty spot on. But at the same time, that is a key thing, and I think people will recognize this when they use Genesis in terms of the flexibility if the lifter has a certain perspective on their needs. And you can also expect to see improvements on that end in the future as well. So, if you have a meet in 4 months, the app is going to, and Genesis specifically, is going to design a training cycle that gets you to that meet so that you can get as strong as possible over those next 4 months. And that training in week 1 of that program is going to look a lot different than week 1 of a program if you are 7 weeks out, right? Those are the priorities kind of shift with proximity to meet. So not only is it the underlying needs, as Zach pointed out, but it is the proximity to the strength test. And I'm very excited about some things we have on the roadmap to further enhance the flexibility of that.
Yeah. So what aspects would you consider would be important when creating a training split?
A training split?
Yes.
So should we jump to mesocycles?
Sure.
Next?
Yeah.
So basically within the full context of a macrocycle, or a training cycle, or a long-term plan, or a full meet prep, whatever you want to call it, you're going to have these phases that we mentioned. So the phases, the general archetypes, you can probably speak to with a little bit more precision than me, but they're, broadly speaking, 3 archetypes. The first is work capacity, the second is hypertrophy, and the third is strength. There's also kind of a subset of strength that's peaking, but there's a lot of overlap there. So for now, I'll consolidate them to just those 3 archetypes. And what you'll see is a slight shift in bias and a shift in focus. And that doesn't mean that you're going to only do sets of 12 in the work capacity phase, but it is going to challenge you in slightly different ways compared to the strength phase. Part of the reason is that it might be quite unrealistic to do strength phase after strength phase after strength phase. If you run 5-3-1, for example, can you really repeat that just over and over and over again? Some degree of, and this gets into another really long discussion about the difference between periodization itself and just variation. There's actually some really good narrative reviews in the literature that kind of make arguments for and against that. But for now, I'll say that there are multiple reasons that we do that. One is to allow for the needs of the lifter to be addressed, like Zach said, because different folks might need different things. And secondly, variation, and that variation can lead to better sustainability and ultimately set up the next phase a little bit better. And that's not some weird, elusive phase potentiation that's magic that our muscle cells understand, oh, I'm in work capacity and now I'm just going to be a springboard for my strength phase. But instead, it is kind of taking the underlying principles when you look at the research with a level head, and then you implement that into a methodology that is Genesis.
Yeah, I think that was a really good overview. I think if you're like diving into the specific aspects of each of the kind of mesocycles themselves, you could go through like literally every single training variable. That'd probably be a little bit excessive to go through literally everything. But just broadly speaking, the work capacity oriented phases are going to be a little bit less specific with respect to exercise selection, a little bit higher rep. And overall, the focus is just to improve your ability to maintain and output high quality performance. So, take somebody who is going to do a couple sets, and after the first one, their performance drops a ton. The idea there is to be able to maintain that high quality performance for more work, so that when we head into a hypertrophy phase, that's going to be really dedicated towards trying to build some muscle in key areas that will help us drive our lifts, that we're going to be able to have the most of that training be really, really high quality, which theoretically will improve our return on our investment. And then after that hypertrophy phase, which is going to be slightly more specific, slightly changing some variables, such as training a little bit closer to failure, maybe slightly more specific exercise selection. And after that, after you've put some time in during those hypertrophy-oriented phases to hopefully really improve that strength capacity, then we can transfer it over into a more strength expression phase where we're going to shift those variables once again to probably increase specificity of exercise selection, increase the average percent of 1RM that we're training at, and then also change the proximity to failure a little bit to really maximize your performance on every single set. That kind of general shift in things seems to, in our experience, allow for really, really smooth training cycles that are both enjoyable from a practical perspective, allows for some of that variation both for psychological and physiological reasons, but also makes sense on paper. The other thing that Josh said that I think is really important to emphasize that it really is just a small shift in bias. You're going to be performing the competition movements throughout the entire training cycle, and I think that's important because potentially older periodization approaches and older approaches to kind of sequencing these different training blocks may kind of leave you completely unprepared for the next one, and then may also decay the adaptations from the previous block. And we try really hard to sequence those in a way that allows you to really focus on the adaptation that we're focusing on, but not lose the things in the past or not prepare you for things coming next. So
you should show up to your strength block not being like, oh, I forgot how to squat something decently heavy.
Exactly.
Because that is something that if you hear those phases, work capacity phase, hypertrophy phase, I think poorly executed iterations of those will lead to that experience. And then by the time you get to the end of the strength phase, you're like, wait, I just got in a groove with heavy squatting. Exactly. Whereas in actuality, that should be in there, at least to some degree, year-round, tolerance permitting. And you can probably speak to that quite well, because did you just finish a work capacity phase?
I did. I'm actually using Genesis right now. And it was a very humbling experience because I have not done 9 reps on a squat in a very, very long time. But it was cool because there's still, in my past programs, when we talk about like a hypertrophy block or a strength block, it was purely a hypertrophy block. I may not do a single or a heavy set for 6 weeks and then transition to a strength block. And now I'm like, oh my God, I haven't touched a heavy squat in 6 weeks. And it, now I have a meet in 6 weeks, and now I'm trying to get used to having
that 6 week out freak out.
Yeah. But I haven't touched a single in 12 weeks or whatever. So I like the fact that it is a work capacity block where I am doing higher reps, but there's still a focus with a heavier training load within the training session or the training session itself.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's good to hear, because that's the goal, is to challenge you in ways that you won't be challenged later on in the macro cycle, but to, like Zach said, not allow that strength skill side of things. So we use top sets to maintain those sorts of things, ensure at minimum they don't decay. Really, we would like them to all improve simultaneously. It's just that you can't work 10 jobs at once, right? So you're kind of just shifting the bias a little bit. And I'll give one quick example of how we shift that bias. Because if you're not bought into periodization, I understand. I think there is like a periodization skeptic crowd, and I think that's for very good reason. Again, you could even make the argument that our training is the Genesis system is minimally periodized, but nonetheless, I'll just give a basic example to explain some of the rationale that's kind of present throughout. If you look at a meta-regression of the effects of RPE on strength gains, so basically what that means, that's a fancy way of saying we're going to take all the relevant research on a topic, put it into a graph, do some important statistical
mumbo jumbo.
But statistical weighting is probably the easiest way to put it for now. And basically look at the relationship. If you imagine on the x-axis you have increasing RPE, and then on the y-axis you have how much strength gain that group exhibited or that group experienced. Basically what you see is a flat line. So in other words, training at higher and higher RPEs does not seem to drive strength gains. But importantly, the only studies we included in that meta-regression, and credit where it's due, this is Zach's paper, so I'm speaking on his behalf here, is that the studies had to be load equated. So if you're in a lower RPE group and Zach is in a higher RPE group, you both, in order to be included in this meta-regression, had to be training with the same percentage of your 1 rep max. So what that means is that because that line is flat, so higher RPEs don't seem to drive strength gains, is that at a given load, you don't really need to train at higher RPEs to get the lion's share of the benefit for strength gains. But that relationship is different for muscle growth. You do see this linear relationship that as you get closer to failure, muscle growth adaptations tend to improve. And if you take a step back and you say, okay, these studies are pretty short term. If we're thinking about long-term development for a lifter using Genesis, we want that lifter to get more jacked. We want their quads to be bigger over time. We want their glutes to be bigger over time. We want their pecs to be bigger, et cetera. And as a result, if in the strength phase, we can lean into the fact that we don't need to prioritize a close proximity to failure, and that will allow your top sets to feel even better, your recovery to be better, and we can maybe do more heavy strength work. Awesome. We'll take advantage of that in the short term, in the strength phases, but in a work capacity phase or a hypertrophy phase, we're going to lean into closer proximities to failure. It's not to say you're going to do bone-crushing failure sets every single time you step in the gym.
Unless you're Zach.
Unless you're Zach. You train past failure every single set.
Masochist, baby.
But we're going to lean into that a little bit more in the name of not only long-term development, but also I'd make the argument for moderate-term development within that training cycle. So that's just one small example. All of that thinking is baked into the design of each individual mesocycle. And it allows you to kind of move the chess pieces around the chessboard to get the most out of your training is the way that I think about it.
Yeah.
I will say that being in the lab, I've learned that I do not know how to train to failure. What I thought was failure is not. So that's been a nice learning experience.
And it's a funny thing to kind of bring up, but like I think that experience is like something not only that I don't think lifters often realize, but it's also something we have to consistently remind ourselves. And this is one of the things that we have built into a few of the training phases is these consistent opportunities to kind of gauge that RAR on a few exercises. And I just think that's one of these execution things that I think goes, it's an easy thing to say. It's an easy thing to note, like make sure your RARs are accurate. And everyone kind of knows that, but I don't think people realize, again, kind of identifying the 80-20 variables. That's one of those really, really important things that we got to make sure we're hitting the appropriate effort that we're prescribing to make sure that we're able to kind of consistently track things up over time. And I just think that's something that is, it's important to know.
Yeah.
Even for somebody as strong as you, it's something to have a good reminder every now and again.
And I like having the AMRAP sets at the end because it just tells me that, okay, I need to go essentially to failure, and that I have no idea what failure was before. That was not 1 to 2 reps in reserve that I was doing on my leg press.
And that's a pretty common piece of feedback we get.
Yeah.
Is that I think someone that tries out Evolve and might have tried out other automated programming systems, you might find that the set volume is quite manageable. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a ton of flexibility, and there might be times and cases where either the system suggests higher volumes or you manually override it such that you train with higher volumes. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of flexibility there, but I wouldn't characterize it, broadly speaking, as like a super high volume program by any means. And that is because we often get the feedback that once you get that quality higher, the training feels way more effective and you don't have to do set after set after set. If you nail these principles, the training can be very potent, very manageable, and progress is often better. And you also stick with it for years and years because that's what you need.
Don't get hurt. Exactly.
Yeah, that's what you need to maximize long-term progression. But I would love to keep talking about mesocycles. Maybe we move on to splits.
Yeah, I was going to say that basically with everything that you guys have said, talking about all of these principles, how is that integrated within Evolve in just doing a training session in and of itself?
Yeah, I think there's a few things when it comes to a training session. So I think first, there's tons of flexibility kind of building out what your week looks like and how the organization of your training sessions are actually integrated. So we have tons of functionality dedicated towards making that as smooth of a process as possible. How does my week look like? Can I move things around to optimize based on my schedule preferences, how my session goes in terms of performance? So we've focused really, really hard on making that user experience, both from feedback from our experience, but also previous Evolve users, to make that as bulletproof as we possibly can. Obviously, there's still going to be areas to improve as we go forward, but we've tried really hard to make that a really user-friendly but also effective solution to the different needs that people have on their layout of their training weeks. Once you get into an actual session, we've also spent a lot of time trying to think about different ways that we can make sure the delivery of the training is as effective as possible. One thing that we've done is we have an in-house kind of percentage of 1RM RPE chart that can help nail in target load assignments really, really well, and try to improve on previous methods of doing that. And then also just the various ways that we've tried to just improve the flow of login training session, being able to reference previous performance for a given exercise, target loads, warm-up loads, switching exercises, custom exercises, persistent training notes. There's so many different things that we've tried to hit as many of the key factors to execute a training session as high of quality as humanly possible within the app.
You can think of it as like a sidekick or a training partner that's in there trying to nudge you towards those higher level principles we started with on a session by session basis. So no more getting in a training split assigned to you and then having to back calculate what days you have to go to the gym versus training in your garage, because I know that there are users that do that, right?
Sure.
Some sessions are at different gyms, and that has certain constraints. Or you've tried that frequency before on squat, and it hasn't worked well, right? No more feeling locked into that, and now it's time to feel empowered to use that training skill and use that experience. Evolve is going to nail it 80+% of the time. But now based on your constraints, your schedule, or your previous experience, or just if you want to experiment with things, which I think is totally reasonable, you have the ability to do that by dragging and dropping your training split, which is something we're really excited about. And then, I would love to be fully exhaustive here, so make sure you're subscribed, make sure you're following along, so you can get more of these examples. But instead of being exhaustive, I'll give one example. Is at the end of the day, training needs to be progressive. And again, it seems simple, but something that a lot of people don't do is they just kind of go in and say, okay, the goal is a triplet 7 today, right? So a top set of 3 reps at an RP of 7, so about 3 reps in the tank. Awesome. But you can imagine how if you're coming off a 10-hour shift at work and you're really tired and motivation to train is a little bit lower, compared to you're coming off a great night of sleep and it's a Saturday, whatever, and you're really excited to be there. Maybe you have more support system there that day, whatever. A triplet 7 can mean something quite different on those days. And we could get into a philosophical discussion of whether that's a good or a bad thing. But nonetheless, by making it easy to reference and to have loading ranges there for you that are not prescriptions but suggestions, goes a very, very long way to keep you honest, even on those days you don't necessarily want to be kind of kept in check, right? So that's a small example of a nudge, right? The other example we mentioned is those last sets AMRAPs to a higher RPE on something like a leg curl, for example, on a more accessory-based movement to get you to train at a closer proximity to failure. Therefore, you're better calibrated for rating your RPE, and now you can carry that forward. So we take those principles, we kind of trickle them down, if you will, or we kind of filter them down at each level that's appropriate and nudge you along the way, but also empower you to override it and to lean into your preferences, lean into your kind of internal feedback and what you're interested in trying within reasonable constraints.
So my last question for you guys is what features are you excited about for Evolve?
I think the number one thing for me, you hit on it already. I haven't directly mentioned it, was just the drag and drop training splits. Like, I think at least in my opinion, when it comes to looking at different training programs, and one of the biggest things that's going to make someone want to do something and something not to do something is if it kind of meets either what they enjoy or what they feel like they need in terms of the organization of the training, totally independent of what the actual programming is. And so I think being able to dial that in, again, both to what you think you need or preferences and having some guidance along with that process, I think is just, again, one of those things that's really simple on paper, but it's something when executed effectively just makes the whole training process a lot more enjoyable.
I think that's my number one as well. I'm not going to lie. That's something I've just always thought needs to exist, and we've finally done it, is that the flexibility of training splits. The runner-up that I'll note is specific exercise selection based on your weak point, or what we like to call your strength limiter, which seems kind of hand-wavy but is actually vital. In our experience, that can be the difference of kind of spinning your wheels for the rest of 2025 or 2026, whenever you're watching this, or beyond, versus having, again, like I said before, very potent targeted training in order to get the most out of what you're doing in the gym. That leads to more sustainable training, that leads you to doing it longer, and that leads to better results. So a basic example is if the app identifies that you are more limited in your hips, so your hip extensors, primarily the glutes, compared to your quads and your squat. So in other words, the glutes are kind of giving out first, or they are the muscle that is likely limiting you at the heaviest loads. Having exercise selection for your accessory work that's specific to that is a lot more potent, a lot more targeted. And we've tried to do that in a very simple way, a very seamless way, but also a very potent way. And I think that's going to be a game changer for a lot of lifters.
Sure. I will say that my favorite feature at the moment is being able to choose squats and deadlifts on separate days. And not that I think that this is just a personal preference, especially just knowing myself, is if I'm doing a heavy squat or deadlift, and that takes so much out of me. The thought of having to do another heavy deadlift right after a squat is just not fun.
Sounds like you need some work capacity.
Yeah, probably. I mean, in a peaking block, obviously you have to squat, bench, and deadlift because it's a meet. Yeah. But just in training, especially in an off season, being able to have that option is really cool. So
100%.
Yeah.
Cool.
Sweet. We just went from top to bottom.
Yeah.
Macrocycle to training session. Let's go.